Welcome to All Grown Up Now, Tales of a Checkered Past. I'm Kenneth D. King, podcasting from my studio near Union Square in New York City. This podcast is an evolution of the tale, All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts. This is Season 2, and it's called Tales of a Checkered Past. It's a collection of short stories from my salad days on up to the present. In each podcast, another self-contained story will be presented. Enjoy. For episode 95, I'm doing a little work that I call The End of the World. Recently, I've been thinking about the idea of being alive to see the end of the world. This is a paramount irrational fear that I've had, one I haven't discussed with anyone, not even my husband, until recently. When I was a kid, I always loved when my parents were getting ready to go out on date night. They both got all dressed up. Miss Ann would give her hair another coat of lacquer, clouds of fresh fragrance, Old Spice for Dad, white shoulders combined with Aquanet hairspray for Miss Ann, wafted out of their bedroom. I enjoyed seeing them both all dressed up, Dad in his olive sharkskin suit, and Miss Ann in one of her good dresses with high heels. They both looked so swell. While they were out, we kids were usually watched over by one of the older neighbor girls, or sometimes by Grandma. This brings me to one of my earliest memories when I was a little boy, before kindergarten. It was one such evening when my parents went out to dinner. Grandma was brought over to stay with us until they returned. The memory of that evening revolves around a tirade that Grandma went into. Now, she wasn't a churchy gal, but somehow she seized upon the topic of the biblical end of the world. You know, Revelations. Grandma went on and on about it, how horrible it would be for those who were alive. She knew. She read it in the Bible. She bore down on us, zeroing in on me especially because my sisters had fled to their bedroom. I can still see her face as she ranted on and on about the world was going to end in fire. "There will be no hiding, no escape," she thundered. "Everyone will die a painful death. Everyone will be burned up. There's no escape." She continued ranting variations of this, whipping me into a blind panic, finally making me cry. I didn't want to see the world end. I didn't want to get burned up. Right about that time, my parents arrived home to find me in a screaming, crying terror. This was one of the few occasions where Miss Ann showed some genuine sympathy for my tears. I cried easily, therefore she was used to it. She sensed something was seriously wrong. When she got me quieted down enough to stop hyperventilating, I told her what Grandma had said. I was still freaked out, so I started crying again. Miss Ann turned to Grandma and yelled, "God damn it, old woman, what the hell were you thinking? You scared the living daylights out of him. Jesus Christ!" Then she turned to my dad and barked, "Get her out of here," which he did. I had nightmares for weeks. They eventually subsided. But that fear has remained to this very day. When the Orange Menace came down the escalator in 2015, I started thinking again about the end of the world. At first, I didn't want to think that I lived in a country that could take that sociopath seriously. That said, since I've had the misfortune to cross paths with several sociopaths in my life, not by choice, I understood You can't predict what they will do, but you can bet that it will be a shit show. His entrance into the race was a signal to the bigots, the racists, and the proudly anti-intellectual that he, like they, wanted to burn everything down. He gave them permission to let their hatred flow free. The one emotion I haven't felt about politics since then was surprise. Shock, anger, frustration, blind panic, exasperation, morbid fascination, embarrassment for my country, but never surprise. The day after the election in 2016, I stayed in bed. My husband Andrew was concerned. I tried to explain to him that while we couldn't predict what the Orange Menace was going to do, we could be certain that it was going to be a shit show. And it has been. Sadly, the effects of having him in power have made that shit show continue even after he was voted out of office. At first, it was a garden variety shit show when we had to start worrying that he was giving confidential information to the Russian ambassador. Then we worried that he was going to start nuclear war with North Korea by talking smack about Kim Jong-un. Andrew and I had several discussions to plan where we would meet with the sirens started, warning us of the approaching nuclear warheads. Andrew started researching the different nuclear bombs and their circles of destruction to figure out where it would be safe. I wanted to know so I could be directly under one, because life as we knew it would end anyway. The very idea that the possibility of being incinerated by atom bombs was the stuff of everyday conversations, that was shocking. Not since I was in grade school had I ever thought about dying in a nuclear holocaust. I understood that in a city like New York, duck and cover wasn't going to do us a bit of good. The clown car kept rolling on, while people would hopefully speculate that he was starting to appear more presidential, that he would grow into the job. But scandals, too numerous to list here, kept popping up. But I wasn't surprised, shocked, angered, horrified, embarrassed, but not surprised. Then came the COVID pandemic. At first, I couldn't imagine that it would get bad. When we had Obama as president, there was SARS and MERS and Ebola, deadly but contained because of the mechanisms that both Republican and Democratic administrations had set in place. I imagined that this would proceed in the same way. However, because the rich people wanted more tax cuts in 2017, the pandemic response team had been defunded and dismantled. The Orange Menace's rationale was that he would go back and get it if he needed it. That's like waiting until your kitchen is on fire to go buy a fire extinguisher. As we know, that pandemic was the cause of over 1 million deaths. Early on, he referred to it as a Democrat hoax, which his followers parroted while the numbers of the sick and dead mounted. In those early days, New York was hardest hit. The wail of ambulance sirens several times an hour became commonplace. Life as we knew it stopped. But I wasn't surprised, shocked, angered, afraid, panicked, but not surprised. Another thing I became aware of during this time was a group in this country that refused to wear masks or follow the science. You know, their freedoms. The Orange Menace enabled, nay, embraced and encouraged these people. I understood these people had always been here, but they stayed under the radar. Like the bigots, the racists, and the proudly anti-intellectual, he had given them permission to emerge from the shadows as well. Their belligerent insistence about the right not to wear a mask and later not to get vaxxed was more important than controlling the spread of a deadly disease. But hey howdy, when they got sick, they wanted the hospitals to get them well, right now. Never mind that if we had all done our part, like my parents did in World War II, that we'd be finished with this faster. One could generally predict who one voted for by whether that person was wearing a mask and later getting the vax or not. While all of this was going on under the Orange Menace, we had 3 Supreme Court justices installed. People who lied to get on the court, quite frankly. Under oath, they all tried to assure us that, oh, no, Roe v. Wade is settled law, and I honor settled law, stare decisis. I felt a glimmer of hope after Biden was declared the winner. New York felt like its old self. People were jovial, talking to each other in the cafes, something we hadn't seen since the pandemic started. After Biden was elected, Andrew said that the Orange Menace would be old news in no time. I wanted him to be right, but I knew otherwise. Then came January 6th. The hateful, ignorant, bigoted band of his insurrectionists stormed the Capitol, urged on by the Orange Menace himself. In my mind, they burned the place down. That was the image I kept seeing in my head. They didn't do that in actual fact, but they did burn down the legacy of the United States, the legacy of the peaceful transition of power. But again, I wasn't surprised. Shocked, angered, horrified, embarrassed, but not surprised. And sadly, Andrew was wrong. We still hear of him and suffer the effects of the bitter fruits of his 4 years in office. The corrupt justices installed on the Supreme Court upended stare decisis and decades of precedent. So now, women don't have the right to bodily autonomy, and now Clarence Thomas is saying he wants to revisit Griswold, contraception, Obergefell, same-sex marriage, and Lawrence v. Texas, sodomy laws. They also took a swing and blew a hole in the separation of church and state with the ruling that school vouchers funded by public money can now be used in church schools. But still, I wasn't surprised. Shocked, angered, afraid, but not surprised. Now, I'd like to blame the current rash of mass shootings on the Orange Menace, but really, that was set in place before he came along. Scalia, in the Heller decision, upended over 200 years of precedent, again, stare decisis. Before, the precedent was that we didn't have the right to guns. That was for the well-regulated militia. In modern times, the well-regulated militia is called the National Guard. But the phrase well-regulated militia was whited out of the Second Amendment by the court. The bitter fruit of this is that we have had, as of late June, over 300 mass shootings in this country. The enablers of the Orange Menace have turned and twisted logic into pretzels, blaming the shootings on everything. But what the real problem is, which is that we don't need weapons of war in the hands of the general public. Still, I'm not surprised, shocked, angered, afraid, horrified, but not surprised. The idea that we don't have an agreed-upon set of facts has also had its effects. Now, in my youth, we all watched Walter Cronkite and got our facts from reliable news outlets. News organizations upheld journalistic standards, so the public could reasonably expect accurate information. There were differing opinions of the facts, but the facts were the facts. But in the age of alternative facts, also known as lies, a phrase popularized by his horrible press secretary, one can't have an intelligent argument anymore. People's opinions are weighted as heavily as actual facts. And if they don't like the facts, they will just shout, "Fake news!" One such conversation is about climate change. 96% of the studies say it is man-made. The other 4% are funded by the fossil fuel industry. Now, the fossil fuels industry learned this from the tobacco industry, which perfected the method of funding studies that show that, well, no, cigarettes didn't cause cancer and death. As they would claim that the science isn't 100%, which no science ever is, they went on to totally discount doing the right thing to mitigate the ill effects. This then gave cover to the politicians and those employed in the industry. I mean, how would it look acknowledging that they were knowingly selling a product that caused cancer? So the climate change deniers are doing the same thing, using exactly the same playbook, so as not to interrupt their profits. In 2019, I taught in China. We taught in a technical school in Hangzhou. The people there were lovely, but the one thing I remember about the place was the pollution. I mean, there was a haze over everything, a beige haze for the entire 2 weeks I was there. I had a whopping migraine for the first 4 days because of it. Whenever I'd look out a window, I would think, oh my God, this is what the US would look like if we didn't have the EPA. And then I'd feel a wave of panic. But with a recent Supreme Court decision essentially gutting the EPA, I think, oh my God, is that our future? Will the skies be choked with beige haze? Will we go back to a time when the rivers caught fire? There's a clock on one of the new buildings in Union Square. It's a digital clock, a large row of LED numbers. When I moved here, and for years after, the time would be indicated by reading from left to right. That would tell the time in a 24-hour format. Reading the numbers from the right to the left would tell how much time was left until midnight. In the last 2 years, however, they've changed it. Now it's a climate countdown clock, telling us just how much time we have until we've passed the point of no return to mitigate the climate change. At this writing, the clock reads 7 years, 15 days, and around 8 hours left until the tipping point has been passed. Seeing the time get shorter and shorter by the day is the point of this clock. The planet will get hotter and hotter unless we do something. But the damage that the Orange Menace has done and continues to do has reduced my hope that right action will be taken. So, will the world end by being on fire? Metaphorically, or an actual fact? Or will we just get poached and parboiled? Because no matter how much profit the corporations and politicians who deny it will make, we all live on the same planet. We are all in this together. These days, my mind goes back to my grandma, who shouted at me all those years ago. There will be no hiding, no escape. Everyone will die. Everyone will be burned up. And all of this fuels my fear about being alive to see the end of the world. This formerly irrational fear feels terrifyingly close to becoming reality. Thanks for listening. You can get the audiobook All Grown Up Now on iTunes, Audible, and Amazon, or from my website, allgrownupnow.com. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Play. If you have any questions, you can reach me through the website, allgrownupnow.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Kenneth D. King, on Facebook at Kenneth D. King Design, or on my main website, kennethdking.com.